Good afternoon, everybody. I think we'll start. It's 1:30, and we'll have the webinar recorded for those who want to watch it, view it later. Please ensure that you have your video and your audio muted today. Our special guest for this, our seventh or eighth webinar in our series, is Don Mackey with E Squared Entrepreneurial Ecosystems out of Nebraska. And Don's going to talk a little about his organization in a few minutes, but it's, again, it's the entrepreneurship ecosystem. What we could be doing better is really an essential part of what we all need to be focused on as community builders and economic developers and leaders. So I'm sure there's going to be some takeaways out of this session that we can all apply. If you have any questions during the presentation, please use the chat function. If you have any issues with chat, please feel free to text my cell phone at 306-381-3900. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Don. Don is going to present for about 20 to 30 minutes, and then there'll be time for discussion and questions following his presentation. Thanks so much, Don, for joining us.
You bet. Thank you for the invitation. I'm honored to be with you today. Good afternoon and greetings from Lincoln, Nebraska, where I call home, although I grew up in a community of about 500 in the Nebraska Sandhills, which is cattle ranching country. My topic today is restart, recovery, and resiliency, entrepreneurship, and rural community prosperity. And let me share just a little bit about myself. It's up on the screen. Our work over the last 40 years has focused on rural communities and economies, primarily in North America, the continental United States. And as we were discussing before the program started today, some of our work in the Canadian provinces. What I'm sharing with you is really what we have learned from communities and leaders across North America. And it's also representative of our journey from traditional economic development that maybe was focused on natural resource industries in rural landscapes and business attraction to really focusing on entrepreneurship as a core development strategy. We would be remiss today if we didn't look at the current environment that we're in. It kind of boggles my mind that within 10 years, we're experiencing a major event. If you think about the Great Recession, at least in the States, and its impact on our economy and society. But now we have the COVID-19 world health pandemic. For many communities, that resulted in shutdown as a way to deal with the pandemic. The potential for recession, deep recession in certain communities across the continent. And at least in the States now, we are seeing significant civil unrest. So that's the backdrop for what is occurring. In the short term, as we deal and cope with the crisis, how do we begin to restart our economies, move to stronger economic and social recovery? But I think it should be important for us to also think about how do we do that in a way that results in more resilient economies and societies as we go forward. And we believe, based on the experience and the work that we've done over these decades, that entrepreneurship done in certain ways can result in much more diverse and resilient economies as well as societies. One of the things that has informed our work was lessons from the U.S. Great Recession of 2006-2010. We worked with a number of folks across the United States in tracking what happened during the recession, but how things emerged post-recession. And I think there were three major outcomes, and these have implications for rural communities, rural regions, but also for entrepreneurship. The first is, and this continues today, at least in the United States, the loss of legacy workers associated with larger employers. Employers, whether government or industry, with 500 or more employers, and a dramatic increase in entrepreneurship. In many cases, initially, people who could not find a good job and moved into entrepreneurship as a way of making a living. We call those necessity entrepreneurs. We also saw entrepreneurship driven by a pretty dramatic increase in outsourcing. As larger employers in the United States case, and I'm going to be referring primarily to US examples because that's the most recent work that we've done, from the US military all the way to state governments, local school districts, to a wide assortment of businesses, really turning to outsourcing as a way to meet their human resource and input needs. And of course, the flip side of that is with outsourcing, you're creating entrepreneurial opportunities for somebody to provide those services, those goods that historically were maybe done by a legacy worker employed with that large employer. The other thing, working with a colleague of ours at the University of Minnesota, Ben Winchester, Ben had documented that there was a very significant uptick in what was an underlying trend pre-Great Recession in 30-year-olds moving from urban areas back to rural areas. And we also documented that as we see this huge demographic of retiring boomers, I'm not retired yet, but I'm part of the boomer generation that also began to migrate from more urban areas to rural areas. We think all three of these trends will be significant as we come out of the pandemic recession, and they represent opportunities for rural areas if we are attuned to them and prepared to take advantage of the opportunities that these wins will create. So with that as kind of a backdrop, let me kind of share our framework that we utilize around supporting communities and regions that are pursuing becoming more prosperous and more sustainable. And we call this the Rural Community Prosperity Framework. We can sure share with you some papers we've done on that if you would like to learn more about it. But at the end of the day, the aspirational goal is how do we create more prosperous communities? Not in the sense that, you know, we create some wealthy people and others are struggling, but how do we in fact raise the prosperity of all the residents in our communities? We create greater mobility and opportunity for people to pursue their dreams. We create higher levels of economic and social security. So the kind of economy that serves the residents of a province or a nation or a community, that's what we're ultimately saying is the end game of this framework. And towards that end, we talk about 5 essentials that, based on our experience and work with communities and regions over the years, that are really critical. The first is building the capacity of communities to engage in their own development. If we want to take control of our future, we have to invest in ourselves and in our communities to not only vision a smart development strategy, but to be able to take advantage of the resources that might be out there to support that game plan. The second, and I think this is particularly true for your landscape, it's definitely true for the Great Plains, where I call the Central Great Plains of the United States my home, and that is regional collaboration. Scale really matters. The ability to organize ourselves, create robust systems of support is just critically important. And the neat thing about entrepreneurship versus some of the traditional development strategies is it lends itself to collaboration. We're not competing with each other, but if we build strong environments that energize entrepreneurial talent, it tends to benefit individual communities, but the region or the province as well. Then there are 3 interrelated strategies that we found to be critically important. And these don't necessarily come in sequence. Think of them as the fabric that goes into a woven cloth. they're all interrelated and they support each other, they stimulate each other. And so the first of these is people attraction, development, and retention. In the 21st century and mature economies like Canada's or the United States, human talent is really foundational. And so to the extent that in the rural areas we can attract people, maybe that's our own kids and grandkids. I'm blessed. Both of my sons have chosen to come back to Lincoln, so we get to see them, on a regular basis, versus them being to the four winds and living in other places. But also, how do we develop that talent? It may be in terms of leaders in our communities, volunteers, but also entrepreneurial talent and the workers who are going to support those entrepreneurs and their ventures. And then finally, how do we retain that? How do we create a stickiness where people go, I want to stay and I want to call this rural community in your part of Canada home? Essential to that are two things: quality of life placemaking. Now, again, my childhood home of Mullen, Nebraska with 500 people has a different quality of life than the community of Lincoln with 300,000 that I live in today. But nevertheless, how do you create genuine quality of life through placemaking that really supports not only the physical environment, but the culture of the community that really stimulates and supports entrepreneurial behavior and progressive change? And of course, we ultimately have to develop a more diversified economy. This contributes to resiliency, and we believe that entrepreneurship is a primary strategy for doing that. So with that as a bit of a backdrop of the broader framework, let me drill down into entrepreneurship-led development. We've had a chance to work with entrepreneurship in a lot of different landscapes, not only in continental United States, but some of our teams worked in Europe, the English-speaking countries of the Pacific Rim, like South Africa and Australia and New Zealand. And I think one visualization is by increasing entrepreneurial behavior, openness to ideas, the ability to support innovation, the ability to build teams that create new ventures, that what we found is contributes directly to increased competitiveness in a global economy and society. Not only competitiveness in the business sense, but in the attractiveness of your community and your region to people who will choose to live there, choose to stay, and building your human talent pool. When you have that dynamic going, you inherently increase the diversification of your economy. And we think this is particularly critical to resiliency. The more diverse your economy is in terms of the kinds of ventures you have, the markets that they're connecting to, excuse me, that adds to resiliency. But it also tends to add to a higher value economy. And let me illustrate what I mean by that. It means that those ventures are doing better. Their ability to provide better jobs and opportunities are increased. And so the overall wealth and well-being of your community and region is stronger. Now, we adhere to the asset-based development philosophy that John McKnight at Northwestern University in Chicago developed. It's used internationally now as a development framework. If you're not familiar with it, I encourage you to look at it, but it kind of is rooted in common sense. When you're building an environment to stimulate and support entrepreneurship as a strategy, focus on the assets you have. Every community has entrepreneurs. Every community has resources that can support entrepreneurs. So start with what you have, and over time, build out both. Increase more entrepreneurial activity, and also build out your support system, ultimately resulting in something we now call an entrepreneurial ecosystem. As I mentioned before, this development model really lends itself to collaboration. So if we think about your region, your entrepreneurial ecosystem in terms of resources that are available can be organized regionally so that individual communities and the entrepreneurs in individual communities can tap into those resources through their communities. But it doesn't mean your community has to have all of those kinds of things, whether it's venture capital or seed capital or mentoring. We can go down the list of the kinds of things that are on the resource side. This is powerful, particularly for rural areas where it's hard for an individual rural community to do all the things it needs to do to be successful. But if you can be part of a regional system and collaborate across those jurisdictional lines, you can build a more powerful and impactful economic and community development strategy. Ultimately, there are several roles in terms of the community, whether this is a neighborhood in a more urban community or a very isolated rural area. The community is at the best position to find the entrepreneurial talent. And we use that word entrepreneurial talent intentionally. It really speaks to the idea that we have people that have entrepreneurial inclinations. They're maybe engaged in entrepreneurial activity. And part of what we're doing is how do we grow that talent so that, in fact, it can create not only a better future for that individual or team, but also ultimately a stronger economy. And then the community's critical role in helping network those entrepreneurs to the assistance that might be available. If we think about the regional role, this is a great opportunity to build an entrepreneurial ecosystem, that resource network on a regional or a provincial basis. And a great model that we'd encourage you to look at, and we could sure share more information, is our neighbor to the south, Network Kansas, and their statewide system of support that includes over 600 resource providers and entrepreneurial communities throughout Kansas, both urban and rural. So let me wrap up with a story. And it's always kind of hard to pick which story to share, but as I looked at the background information and the fact that many of you probably on this webinar today are in rural communities, I wanted to pick one of the communities that I've worked with for a very, very long time, and we're actually doing a 30-year case study of this community for the UN Marion Kauffman Foundation right now that hopefully we can share with you. And it's Ord, Nebraska. Chances are you may not have been to Ord, Nebraska. Its location is rural north central Nebraska. Just to give you a little bit of their background, it's farm and ranch dependent. It really has had historically a pretty undiversified economy, so the community was founded to support area ranches and farms. And it was a community that was really hit by the 1980s farm crisis in the United States. And following that, the community woke up, and as agriculture was getting stronger, realized that they had lost 50% of their businesses, that this chronic and severe depopulation that had really been going on since the 1930s was accelerating. And a group of leaders, which is always the case, came together and said, we need to do something differently. And so 2000 really was the pivot point. The world hadn't changed, but it was a point in which a critical mass of folks in this community of 2,100, the county has about 4,200 people, came together and said, we need to find a pathway forward. One of the things to note about Ord, and I think this is probably true in your part of Canada, is this is a hub city for a very rural region. And so the larger population that is connected to Ord through their hospital, other services, is about 7,500. Still pretty small, but larger than the 2,100. One of the things that is unique about the Ord story is how they've mobilized resources. And one of the first things they did in 2000 is through a vote of the people, They levied a local option sales tax to support their entrepreneurship initiative by hiring staff and creating a gap financing fund. But they also worked with the Valley County Community Fund, which is an affiliate of the Nebraska Community Foundation. It's a place-based community foundation, and it's played a critical role in not only supporting entrepreneurship directly, but addressing some of those other things like placemaking, people attraction and retention and development. And so it too began in the 2000s with a gift from Alice and John Wozab, about $2 million that sparked the foundation's formation. That's grown dramatically since the 2000s. And it's a strategic partner with the local economic development group, city, the county, other stakeholder groups. A couple of the things that they've really invested in is they have probably one of the best leadership programs. They call it the Sinovation Valley Leadership Academy. About 20% of the adults and youth in the community have gone through the academy over the years. And it's really broadened their leadership pool and an engagement by their citizens. Another major investment is Org recognized early on that culture, the arts and the humanities is really important to quality of life. And so they took their old movie theater, which had closed, and they converted it into the Husk. Of course, this is corn production country, so the Husk Cultural Center and programming really became the hub with staffing and programming that significantly improved the quality of life through the arts and humanities. Downtown revitalization, there's a whole set of things. But they also are the underwriter of a very comprehensive youth entrepreneurship and engagement program. And they also serve as this kind of coalition builder. The foundation and its leadership are saying, here's an opportunity. How do we bring people of our community together? Maybe fund some research like a feasibility study to keep things moving. So let me transition to what this community's done since 2000 when it moved from crisis to really transformative change. And I think it's just really telling. One is they have dramatically diversified their economy, and they have significantly increased the value of their economy. Bottom line, people are making more money, businesses are doing better, and the overall well-being of the community is significantly improved over this now 20-year period. I think one of the critical things is the community has realized it has to invest in itself. And this is kind of a startling number, but over this 20-year period, we've documented $250 million of new private and public investment from Main Street businesses like Scratchtown. Scratchtown was created by Caleb Holler and his wife and some partners. It's a brew pub. It has a statewide reputation, and it benefited from the gap financing fund within the entrepreneurial ecosystem, but also investment in schools, their healthcare system. It's made a difference in the overall vitality of the community. But for this community, at least in the Great Plains that stretches from the prairie provinces in Canada all the way into northern Mexico, including my home state of Nebraska, population loss, particularly the loss of young people and then retirees as they move to where their children are, is a huge issue. So for this community, stabilizing their population, regrowing their population was a huge bottom line metric. And as you can see on the slide, one of the things that they celebrate is in the last decade, they've seen a 50% net gain in 30 to 34-year-olds. This really reflects that their people attraction strategy, that they're bringing back not only their children and grandchildren, but they're bringing spouses and other people with no attachment to the community are choosing to live there. And these people are filling critical jobs in the community, but also have really energized the business community. where the average age of business owners in the community has dropped from the 60s now down into the high 30s. And that reflects this introduction of a whole new generation of entrepreneurs and leaders in the community. The other thing, another metric that they use that I think is really telling is school enrollment. And today, if you look at kindergarten, first and second grade, they have twice the enrollment in those early grades as they do in their high school if you look at sophomore, junior, and senior classes. To them, that speaks the future of the community is bright and optimistic, and there's a sense of hope that it can get better. So in conclusion about this story, and one reason I share it is, if a community like Ord, I mean, there's hundreds of communities like Ord's in the Great Plains within North America. If they can do this, then the potential is you can do it as well. So Ord and the Valley County region is now growing again. The overall demographic health of the region is improving as we see not only these 30-year-olds returning, but we're also seeing a higher rate of retiring boomers and folks that are choosing not to leave but to stay, in part because their kids haven't left, so they're going to stay in town. And then the other thing that's kind of striking is the overall personal income profile and wealth profile for the households in this region has improved dramatically when compared to peer communities in Kansas, Nebraska, and South Dakota. So in the 30 minutes I had with you today, we only had the opportunity to kind of give you a high-level view of this framework and one story that I hopefully will inspire you that there are opportunities as we come out of this COVID recession and we think about how we rebuild our economy and our communities. And with that, I'm going to stop. And I would be happy to take questions and comments.
Thanks so much, Don. I have a few questions and comments for you. You touched on a few threads that we've conversations we've engaged in previous webinars during this series. So the Ord example seems very transferable to Saskatchewan. We're trying to encourage communities here to cooperate and work within their trading area, which is generally an hour or so, 100 kilometers or so radius around the community. Typically, the population could be within that 5,000 to 8,000. So those are small organic areas that we feel are natural areas of economies that can be leveraged. So I love your example of Ord. Secondly is the community foundation aspect. In one of our earlier sessions, we did highlight the community foundation as a vehicle to create local wealth. We have few of them in Saskatchewan, and the ones that we have do not engage in the community and economic development sector. They tend to be more social, even though it is compliant with our Canada Revenue Agency. So we're encouraging communities to consider the foundation model. Now, I noticed in the US, community foundations as well, they can play another role as a rural development hub. There was a paper that was produced by the Aspen Institute last fall, and that's something we don't see here. And again, it was the subject of another webinar. We really feel that hub approach, and a hub could be different things to different groups of communities, but we don't have that driver here. And whether it's the foundation, do you feel in the US, any other examples besides foundations that you're aware of development hubs?
Yeah, let me speak to the foundation piece first, because I really believe it is a powerful tool that we underutilize. And so in my home state of Nebraska, the Nebraska Community Foundation is about 25 years old. It was created to help communities like Ord create funds. And Ord was actually one of the early funds to join the Nebraska Community Foundation. Today, 25 years later, the Nebraska Community Foundation has over 400 rural communities across the state of Nebraska that have funds through the Nebraska Community Foundation's example of this kind of collaboration, and the collective grant making of those funds now exceeds the investment by federal and state government into rural development in Nebraska. But the beauty is this money is controlled locally, and so local communities have the ability to direct it. And I know in Ord, that fund has really played critical roles in so many ways that's contributed to the success I talked about. So anyway, I just wanted to say, wouldn't it be beautiful that in Saskatchewan, you know, in 25 years, you had a vehicle like that, and then your communities could participate. It's just a powerful model. And there's other states where there are similar models, but I'm most familiar with this one in my home state. And then remind me the second question.
Just in terms of the Rural Development Hub, and I guess we could, because I've been following the hub concept and there's different models and we have our own recommendation of what we would like to see here in Saskatchewan. I'm just wondering if the community itself is not driving community economic development, what other organizations are you aware of that may be assuming that function?
Yeah, based on our experience, really good question. Based on our experience, we kind of embrace what we call a top-down, bottom-up strategy. Ideally, you have at the provincial level or the regional level an organization, maybe it's a regional development organization, a regional university, maybe a nonprofit, development group, maybe a community foundation. That kind of takes on the role of saying, what are the things we need to do at a regional or provincial level? And then the bottom up is this idea of entrepreneurial communities, which Ord was one of the first entrepreneurial communities in Nebraska, where the local community is finding the entrepreneurs and supporting them, but they're tapping into this regional or provincial level set of resources. And when you put those two together, it becomes really important. But specifically to your question, at least in the States, it's either a state government, a regional university, a community foundation, or some kind of regional development organization, either public or nonprofit, that typically is serving as that hub.
Okay, thanks, Don. And that was another point I was going to make is here we have a number of community colleges or regional colleges. Mm-hmm. And I know we have one that's joined us today, one of my board members, and I was just wondering, could there be more of a role in Saskatchewan in terms of the driver for talent and coming together in some sort of fabric as part of that ecosystem, of course. And that's something that I'd like to see happen here in the province. I guess I think those are the points that came to me. I don't see any questions from our participants or attendees today. I did want to highlight your website. You do have a number of free resources that you're willing to share. Don's website is energizingentrepreneurs.org. Have I got that right, Don?
You got it. Yep, okay. That's correct.
And what I'm going to do, what we'll do here at SEDA is we'll be sending out a link in our weekly newsletter next week to highlight Don's participation this week. We'll link our readers to the resources. And I'm hoping we have a chance to work together in the future as the entrepreneurship ecosystem becomes more of a priority here in the province. The topic has come and gone over the last 12 to 15 years, particularly, and I hope we can prioritize it again and come together. There's a lot of organizations in this province. If we can align and work together to a common cause, I think that's what we need to do now. So thanks so much. I really appreciate it, Don. Look forward to working with you again, I hope in the future.
Yes, thank you. Consider us a resource, and to all of you, be safe, hang in there, and all our best as we all try to work through the current challenges that we face. So thank you.
Wonderful, Don. Now, next week, we have 2 webinars left in our series, so join us next Thursday at 1:30. Our special guest will be David McLean, Vice President of the Canadian Manufacturers and Exporters Association, and Scott Bryant, Senior Partner with WaveTech. WaveTech is a specialist firm in business and investment attraction, so they're going to be talking about some opportunities in specific sectors with us next week. Thanks again for attending. Take care, everyone.